Welcome to the Political Trenches, local government at work. We're here to unpack the key issues, explore what's at stake for communities across the province of Ontario heading up to the 2025 Ontario Provincial Election, scheduled for Thursday, February 27th. Now, we are joined by two remarkable municipal leaders, Councillor Alysson Storey and Councillor Lukas Oakley. Alysson Storey, a councillor for Ward 6 in Chatham-Kent, brings with her a wealth of experience in government, communications, and strategic planning. With a background spanning the cultural sector, municipal governance, and advocacy, she's been a strong voice on issues like accessibility, public libraries, and community engagement. Lukas Oakley, councillor for Ward 2 in the County of Brant, made history as the youngest councillor ever elected in his region. A chemistry graduate turned policy advocate, Lukas has been deeply involved in progressive politics, championing sustainability, transparency, and responsible development. So with that introduction out of the way, Alysson, Lukas, thank you so much for joining us in the Political Trenches.
Thank you
Thanks for having us.
So I'm going to start off with just two pointed questions directly at each one of you, and I'm going to start with Alysson, if you don't mind. Councillor, how would you describe the state of Ontario municipalities' issues when it comes to this provincial election?
Well, I would say it's a tough time to be in a municipal context with the province. And this election, I think the general consensus that I am hearing in my community, which is sort of in southwestern Ontario, is we're not entirely sure why we're having an election at all right now. And that money could be so much more efficiently spent with some rather pressing needs. But here we are with an election, so it is what it is. But I think it's something that in this short time frame, municipalities are really scrambling to get our messages heard with the decision makers at Queen's Park, because there are many, and I'm sure we'll touch on quite a few of them today, but it's one of those things where we have affordable housing and homelessness is a absolute, we're in the red zone crisis level with that. From small rural communities to the big cities, what I've learned now is that it's basically, this is an issue that used to be concentrated in larger urban areas, and now almost every community is facing it. Infrastructure is something that, from a council perspective, you don't always hear about it in those terms from your constituents, but from a council budget perspective, that is a massive financial commitment and an issue that we're finding. I know in Chatham-Kent, our infrastructure is 50% funded. So those are probably the top three: affordable housing, homelessness, and infrastructure are three issues that I know municipalities are facing across the province, and what we're trying to get through to our provincial decision makers on, and I would say with mixed results, and with only, 2 weeks when we're recording this, left in the election. We don't have a lot of time to get that in front of them. So we're screaming from the rooftops whenever we can, and we certainly hope somebody's listening.
So just on that note as well, we are recording this on Friday, February 14th at about 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. There is a Northern Leaders debate tonight in North Bay. We are not sure if there's going to be another debate later on, but it is expected, and there could be municipal issues talked about that. But for you, Lukas, are the municipal challenges that Alysson just talked about being talked about by the party leaders? Because from an outsider's perspective, it doesn't seem that way.
Since the election has started, not really. The leaders have definitely talked I would say a good game, or at least try to talk a good game when they're at the conferences, when they're at Roma, AMO, so on and so forth, when they're talking directly to municipal leaders. All three of the official opposition parties or not official opposition parties, all three of the opposition parties that are sitting have committed to new deals for municipalities, things like that. But it's certainly not really a topic of conversation at the door or really from their campaign standpoint right now. I think there's definitely that focus on tariffs right now. And one sort of funny thing that came out of that is, during the initial launch of the tariffs, Premier Ford did announce that they were going to have an Ontario focus for tariffs, and suggested all 444 municipalities should jump on and do the same. Except we can't do that because the Municipal Act doesn't allow us to have that sort of discrimination in the procurement process. And when there's no sitting government because an election has been called in amidst of this trade war, we don't have the ability to talk to a sitting government to make those changes so that we can follow through with what could be a good idea. So it's certainly there's not a lot of focus on the issue right now for municipal politicians.
I'm going to jump in too, and actually just, Lukas, if I may follow up on that point just a little bit, and that is about the mood of the electorate. Perhaps, fortunately, you're halfway through your term and still have halfway to go. You've talked about housing and homelessness internally. You've talked about external things like tariffs and international trade. Do you sense any sort of a mood in the electorate generally? And is there any of that might apply to how it has an impact on local government?
I think folks are only just tuning into the provincial election. I've done some door knocking during this provincial election. For the longest time, folks weren't really engaged in it yet. And even amongst the folks who are, I mean, there's people who are out of the country because it's the middle of winter, so people fly all over the world where it's a lot warmer. And just with the snowstorms, there could be a snowstorm like we had this week on election day, and then what is that going to do to our turnout? So I think the electorate is really not understanding, I think, as Alysson had said earlier, why we're having this election at all right now. It really does seem poorly timed. Of course, there's Ford's reason is to get a new mandate to deal with Trump. However, all the opposition leaders have agreed that they would help support any anti-tariff measures, trade war measures. So I don't think it's really landing with people. So yeah, and in terms of local government, I mean, our turnout in Brant County in 2022 was I believe it was 21% turnout. So there's just an increasing level of I wouldn't necessarily call it voter apathy. It's a lack of feeling that we can make a difference if we do get out to the polls.
Before we finish up on the provincial election into things, I'll direct this one perhaps to Alysson, and that Chris and I were talking just a few minutes before you joined us about the topic of endorsements. And there's a couple of news stories about local officials, mayors, say, endorsing provincial candidates. That's not something that has historically happened. And I'd be interested, Alysson, getting your feeling on the appropriateness of that, the effectiveness of that, any of those sorts of things that you might have.
Well, I think that I haven't seen that much of that either, Ian. So that's interesting to learn. I haven't heard much of that yet this election. But the political news has kind of been, all the oxygen has been kind of sucked out of the room by our neighbors to the south. But I think generally speaking, it's good to stay independent and nonpartisan during provincial elections because while we may have polls that suggest that a certain party is likely going to win in this election, you don't know until the election day, right? And I think one of the attractions to me to municipal local government is the fact that folks from across the political spectrum work together. And we don't get turned off automatically. We don't shut our ears and our eyes to folks that approach us with ideas or compromises or suggestions just because of the color of their party, right? Which is automatically sort of a shutdown for different contexts in the provincial and federal arenas. So I personally, I don't feel comfortable unless there's something absolutely dramatic and sort of deal breaking. I think it's better to stay neutral because you don't necessarily know who you're going to be working with. And politics is both the short game and the long game, right? Folks that you might have endorsed one term and not endorsed others, that person you did not endorse could be on the docket next term. So it's one of those things where it's a slippery slope. And I know folks have very strong feelings. Certainly, I have my own strong feelings about federal and provincial politics, but from a municipal perspective, I do not think, I think that's a very gray area for mayors and councillors to come flat out and say, like, I'm endorsing this person and I think this is who you should endorse as well. I definitely feel like that's a gray area that we should probably steer clear of, because folks in politics and everything else have long memories, and you don't want to put your community at risk because you might have perhaps made an endorsement that I'm sure folks are doing it with with good intent, but I think right now things are so polarized.
Mhm.
You really risk that soaking into municipal politics as well, and that's one reason why I like the local government, because that there is sort of that distance from the political partisanship.
Sure. Thanks. Lucas, you might have an opinion on this too.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in on that with, I think one of the other sort of pitfalls to potentially that, that there were a number of mayors that endorsed Premier Doug Ford. I don't believe I saw any endorsements from municipal leaders for the other party leaders, but where something that I think is not talked about a lot is when these mayors do these endorsements or come out with any sort of statement, it's sort of taken by the public as it's an endorsement by the entire council, or the entire, that's the will of council, because that is one of their purposes as mayor is to conduct and express the will of council. So I think that's also sort of a bit of a I don't want to say dangerous, but perhaps inappropriate place to be, where then you're speaking on behalf of 10, 15, however many councillors you may have, sort of stifling their own voice, and where they may be politically by coming out as a mayor and endorsing one candidate or another, since the electorate will often read that as well, the county or council or city has thus endorsed this candidate, rather than it being their own personal opinion. And I think that's where, especially when people are doing endorsements through a personal account versus a professional account, that's where I think the lines can get muddier.
Sure. Thanks. Neither of you have mentioned an upside to endorsements, which is interesting. However, just for the sake of time, I'm going to continue on. And something else that's unique, well, very close to unique anyway, about Ontario now through this provincial government has been the institution of strong mayor powers in various urban municipalities throughout the province. I'd be interested to get your take on how well these are working. And I mean, recognizing still in terms of government, it's early days. But what your opinion on strong mayors? Maybe Lucas, I'll start with you on this one and see.
For sure. So my understanding with the sort of initial launch of the strong mayor powers is they were intended to help the province reach specific goals in specifically housing, because there are a lot of municipally created barriers to building housing, for right or wrong. That's the reality of the situation, and I've really not seen it used in many ways for that fashion. Quite often, actually, I've seen strong mayor powers being used to oppose building housing. So I think there's sort of a juxtaposition of what it's been said that's going to be used for versus what it is used for. And I think as well, it's, it would have been one thing, whether you agree with strong mayor powers in general or not, it would have been one thing if folks went into the 2022 election knowing they were electing a strong mayor versus thinking they're electing one voice among many. And that could have different conversations on which type of person, what people you want to elect as mayor. And people might have taken that decision differently had they known upfront that that's what they were going to get. So I think it's, come 2026 and we have our next municipal election, provided strong mayor powers are still in place, I think, it's a little bit more equitable at that point because people at least know what they're getting into, versus where it's been sort of slapped onto us partway through a term. And my own council is not large, or my own municipality is not large enough to have strong mayor powers, but we border city of Brantford, and I know that has certainly thrown a wrench into things, particularly as it relates to the budget process. It's no longer as collaborative a process. It's the mayor's budget, and you have to have 2/3 majority to change anything in that budget, and that definitely changes the conversation considering everything is budget driven. So I think there's it's been interesting seeing it roll out sort of midterm.
Sure, thanks. Next one then to Alysson. We've generally been talking about Ontario, of course. That's where our focus is at the moment. What do you think that those people who are watching who may be outside Ontario can learn from what's happening in local government in Ontario? Is there anything that you think Ontario does locally particularly well, or perhaps as a note of caution?
Well, I would definitely piggyback onto Lucas's comments about the strong mayors for sure. I'm not aware that that exists in any other province. Ian, you might know better than I, but I don't think that mechanism
Correct.
exists. I think anytime that you implement a major change to governance is something you need to do thoughtfully and through consultation and through following proper steps. And that did not happen with this. And I think what I've learned as a counselor, and I'm a first-term counselor, halfway through my first term, and what I've learned is the risk of unintended consequences.
Mhm.
And you often think something is great on the surface, but you need to think these things through because often something entirely different ends up happening that you did not plan for if you don't think about these decisions well ahead of time. And so I would caution, if you're from outside of Ontario, I would caution other provinces from implementing any kind of change of governance to municipal structures in the middle of a term without consulting municipalities and without doing so, like Lucas said, along with an election. So folks are clear when you're going into the next term what to expect. I find that disingenuous. I find that undemocratic. And I do worry again, that is when you start taking away certain democratic rights, that is a very, very slippery slope. So I would not encourage other provinces to follow that lead. Uh, I do think that in general, municipalities should avail themselves, and this is a bit of a self-serving plug, but every municipality has, or every province has provincial associations that advocate on their behalf, as well as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which I'm a board member of, that advocate on municipalities' behalf. And those organizations do excellent work. And I would encourage you, if you, but I don't think membership is mandatory. There is usually a fee to join, but that membership money goes right to advocacy for you and me. So I would encourage you, if you're in a municipality, check out whether or not you're members of your provincial organization. For example, in Ontario, it's called the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, as well as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, because these are groups that work incredibly hard, have paid staff also, which a lot of us do not have working on our behalf in our communities in terms of work that we do from a council perspective. And so right now, having those strong voices is huge. We have the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, is in Washington as we speak, advocating for municipalities in this tariff chaos alongside our federal counterparts. So those are the types of things that I really want to encourage wherever you are in Canada. As a municipality, utilize those relationships, utilize those associations that you can be part of because they are extremely useful. They're extremely well organized. Lots of very knowledgeable people who are advocating for our needs because often the municipal voice is not always heard when we're individual, but collectively it's a lot stronger. So those are probably the two big lessons I would share with other folks outside of Ontario.
Thanks. That's some passion you've got there. So, first term counselor, I've got a two-parter now for you. I believe you used to work for the municipality too, some
I
time
did.
ago. So,
Yes,
my
I did.
questions, my two-parter is, first of all, as a counselor, is the job what you thought it was going to be? And the second is, how hard was it to move from one side of the council bench to the other side of the council bench and maintain role clarity?
That is a great question. I think moving from it's been about 10 years since I've been a municipal staff person, so that was quite a while ago now. But definitely a shift in how you make decisions. I was basically a middle manager in a large organization. We have about 2,200 staff, so it's quite a large food chain, so to speak. And I was about middle of the pack there. So most of the things I was doing, I love my job, but I was not a key decision maker. That floated up to the GM level, who then brought it to council. So I found it hugely helpful going into this term, knowing the decision making tree, so to speak, and how a lot of those decisions get made, and even just basic like the staff people. A lot of folks that I work with are still here, and so I know who to call and how to reach out to folks, and just general knowledge about the community. We're a large geographic area. I know like where are the libraries, where are the arenas, like this just general political institutional knowledge was very helpful for me to have going in.
Mhm.
So I found that very useful. But the decision-making piece with the buck stops here with us on council was a huge shift. Definitely. You feel that pressure going in. Um, and I welcome that, and I really enjoyed it overall. The role clarity piece is definitely, I think I had to remind myself that I shouldn't be going to Joe and Jane and everyone. I need to follow the proper protocol, which in our municipality is through the CAO. Everything goes through the CAO, and then he farms it out to the right staff person because you don't want. We have a large council, 18 people. You don't want 18 of us emailing and calling random people in administration with random questions or random requests. Like, can you do like that's not how it works. That can result in chaos as well. So I definitely need to remind myself, even though I know, Judy, the clerk from a previous iteration, I need to respect those boundaries and, follow the proper protocol for asking for information, for requesting things get done, etc. So that was a learning curve for sure.
Okay.
That's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see that, Chris? Twice she's mentioned that was a great question. I don't think we need to talk about anything else.
Chris has had
I'd
some
like
good
to.
questions. Yeah, just great questions all around.
There we
Kudos.
go. I have a two-parter for Lukas too, and that is, I believe, Lukas, you are one of two elected representatives within your ward. What's it like having advantages, or are the advantages or disadvantages to having a shared ward? And my second question then, as Chris mentioned during his introduction, you were the youngest person, I believe, who'd ever been on council there. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that? So the ward system, and then for you personally.
Yeah, so the ward system actually, I think it's quite interesting. So we're part-time counselors at the County of Brant, and I think I think the vast majority of municipalities in Ontario are part-time counselors. So
Mhm.
the sort of benefit of having that two counselor system is because we're both part-time and we have other responsibilities, it's not possible to have the level of coverage that constituents do expect for any one individual. So it's great having another person that I can either bounce ideas off of, or I'll take this constituent, you take that constituent, and we sort of share the workload there. And in particular, when one or either of us goes on vacation or something like that, has some sort of period of unavailability, there's coverage sort of built in there, which is really nice. The disadvantage, I think, is I do think that there would be more value for your tax dollars. Your tax dollars would go a bit further if, rather than having two counselors that we pay $36,000 a year for, you instead have one counselor that's full time, and rather than two people half-assing it, you have two people who can pour their whole heart and soul into it, which I would love to be able to do, but I just, like, financially I can't make it work. Like, I have to pay my mortgage, so I can't be as dedicated to the role as I want to, and same goes with my colleague Councillor House. um, I think there would be some efficiencies found there, and certainly there's a level of continuity with having one person versus multiple people. But in terms of our current paradigm, which is part-time counselors, I think it is an overwhelming benefit there, having that partner there, even if it isn't as efficient, I think, as having one full-time versus a two part-time. And as for me being the youngest, it's interesting. I'm the youngest in the relatively short time frame that the County of Brant has existed. So it's only existed as a single-tier municipality for 25, or I guess coming on 26 years now, since the Mike Harris government, when there was all the amalgamations. County of Brant went from actually uniquely voluntarily amalgamated in 1999 for fear of a larger amalgamation with the city of Brantford being considered, which is ironic because every couple of years, including just this past January, city of Brantford does threaten to annex or amalgamate us because they feel we're not working well enough with them. And I think there's some fair points there where we could be working together a bit better, but at the same time, it's a little hard to work well with someone when they're holding a gun to your head. So, there's that to consider. But in terms of being the youngest, I mean, it's one of the things that really stands out to me is on the night of sort of our inaugural meeting. I was talking to someone roughly my age, and they're like, it's great to see people our own age being involved and having shared life experience. And across, my council, we have people who were elected at age 26, myself, all the way to someone who was elected just recently at age 72. So we have representation across all the generations, and we have a lot of sort of that generational views represented on our council, which is nice. Some of the disadvantages are, I will go places and be treated like a child, which is, the unfortunate reality of people do have that sort of bias. But, it doesn't get under my skin. And sometimes people underestimate you can be a benefit. So, it's overall, I think, a positive.
Thanks. I got one more question for each of you before I pass it over to Chris, and that's for Alysson, perhaps. You made a reference to FCM, and you seem quite passionate about it. How did you get involved in FCM in the first place as a first termer?
Yeah, actually, it was fairly straightforward. After the election, when we all were elected, they sent out an email, I'm assuming to all membership municipalities, and saying because certain folks who were on the board previously were not reelected or chose not to run again, so they had gaps in their board to fill out the end of the year, because right now we're changing over to 2-year terms, but to this point they have been 1-year terms. And I was looking for something that would engage my sort of interest on a larger scale in terms of how we fit into the bigger picture. And FCM was not an organization that I was that familiar with. So I thought, well, I'm going to give this a try. I think this is going to be useful for me as a new councillor to learn both how we fit into the bigger picture with the feds, as well as learn from other councillors and meet other councillors from across Canada. And I have to say, and I've been reelected twice since, which is wonderful. I'm so grateful. Being part of FCM has been probably one of the most valuable experiences of my life. It's just been such a worthwhile organization to be part of, because the folks who get involved in these organizations are the doers, right? They are the ones who self-select, because you're not getting paid. Like it's more work, it's more on your plate to address. So folks who are volunteering and stepping up for this, they care, they are hardcore, and they are really dedicated to their municipalities. And I'm sure like the same applies for AMO, our provincial organization, and the other like Rural Ontario Municipal Association, Roma. There are a few other organizations that represent various needs. But for me, FCM was a really interesting opportunity to meet elected officials from across Canada. And I have learned so much from them. And I've also had the opportunity to really learn more about the federal government and how that operates. And even though we are creatures of the province, municipalities are creatures of the province, the role the feds play cannot be understated. And I have found that extremely valuable. And I have a Rolodex. Well, anyone know what a Rolodex is anymore? I mean, I've got okay, thank you. I don't feel super, speaking of generational information. But my contact list, I have councillors and mayors and deputy mayors and staff that I can call from coast to coast to coast if I have an issue in Chatham-Kent that I would love help with, and I've done that. And so that benefits not only me as a councillor, but my council, and my community. If I can bring back best practices and ideas and suggestions and warnings, what not to do as well from other municipalities that have been there, done that. So I can't encourage it and recommend it highly enough to any municipal politician, no matter where you are on your council journey, whether you're a first termer or more. I would highly recommend it.
I feel like that was a shot. I feel like that was a shot across the bow to Lukas there. Lukas, get involved.
Lucas, Lukas and I can talk off. I feel like Lukas has got a lot going on already, but obviously we'd love to have you join our Ontario caucus.
Resistance is futile.
Yeah.
My last question then would go to Lukas, whether or not he joins, and that is, what do you see, Lukas, in terms of interest in standing for local government in your region? You're halfway through the term. You might see some tire kickers out there. I know that, of course, there's the provincial election, and then we'll likely have a federal election after that too. But then 2 years from now, less than 2 years from now, we'll end up with a municipal election as well.
So it's interesting. I've been trying to recruit people to run, not against anyone but because we need more people involved, and it's been excruciatingly difficult. It's not it's at this point it's not been made an attractive position for many people.
Right.
You know, it's low pay, it's many hours. There's the sort of public vitriol side of things where no matter where you are, no matter whether you're progressive, conservative, wherever you stand in the spectrum, there's going to be people online who will tear you to shreds over anything, over the slightest thing, and it's really challenging with that sort of toxicity. And there's been lots of conversation about this over the last little while. Like I saw there was several federal MPs who are not running for election for just that reason. And it's a shame because I've talked to many great people who like our community or their community would be so lucky to have represent them, or to run to represent them, to get their ideas and into the zeitgeist. And there's just so little interest in doing it because of sort of that political toxicity. There's also the compensation, just it doesn't make sense for what it is for for the people that we want to run for these roles. For them to take time away from something that puts food on the table is very challenging. So I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of great people who would be fantastic in a role like this, and very little biting, which I think is to our detriment.
Thanks.
Ian just texted me and said no one on the political trenches has ever said the word zeitgeist. So congratulations. Congratulations on being the first.
Travel word.
No.
That's right.
Ian has asked the Ontario questions. I'm going to ask the very political questions now. Now, you are in the midst of a political election. The Ontario campaign is being underway, and you have less than 2 weeks by the time this airs, and potentially less than a few days from when the full interview of this airs for voting to commence on the 27th of February. Doug Ford was a former municipal leader. Bonnie Crombie was a former municipal leader. I believe Merritt Stiles was a former trustee, school board trustee, if I'm not mistaken. So they all have that local experience. But as Alysson so eloquently said, municipalities are looked at as the creatures of the province. How do you believe, and I'm going to start with Lukas on this one, how do you believe that the three parties have done outreach to municipalities to address those municipal issues? Do you think one party stands out over top of the other, or is municipal issues not something that is often talked about at a provincial campaign because it's just not a winning issue?
I don't think there's been, and I think we mentioned this before, I don't think there's been a lot of conversation about it so far during this campaign. There's been a few sort of hints or side comments, but it's not really been a focus. I would say to at least some extent, all of the parties have done outreach. The conclusions they've gotten to, I don't know if I necessarily agree with the sitting government, or the former sitting government rather, with some of the conclusions that they've reached. At every single conference I've been to, at the Bear Pit, there is always the question of our municipal finances don't make sense anymore because you've downloaded all of this responsibility onto us. We're using a taxation method from centuries ago. Like, we need something to change. We need something to update. And that sitting government has not given any indication of changing things. The current funding formula is property taxation, but then also these grants where Alysson and I are both in sort of rural municipalities, so we often compete for the same types of grants. So in order to get funding, we have to take the knives to each other in order to compete for this limited pool of funding that is not sufficient for the need. I would say on sort of to contrast that, all the opposition parties have said that they'll bring in a new deal with various levels of details and minutia between them. to be fair to the sitting government. It's also very easy to say that from from the opposition chair rather than when you're sitting in government, how you're actually going to make that change. And I think also to Alyson's point that there's certainly places where the federal government can step in and where you need a valuable partner like a FCM to do so. So I think there's they are listening. I don't know necessarily whether or not they're getting the points we want them to. And it's certainly not really making it into the public discussion right now, I don't think. Which to sort of touch on that as well, we're quite uniquely AMO, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, for the first time ever is running a third-party election campaign addressing these issues because it has gotten so dire on so many things like housing, like affordability, like municipal taxation, like housing and or I said housing, homelessness and addictions issues. These things have gotten to such a place of crisis, and we've been left to try to pick up the pieces there.
Okay, I'm going to follow up with the Lukas there, and then just a quick yes or no. In your conversations with the people of the County of Brant, has anyone in the last 2 weeks of this recording come up to you and said, "What's that AMO campaign that's been running?" Or is that so far, and I'm going to quote, it's going to be said twice on this show, zeitgeist, that people are just not even paying attention to what's being put on air or what's being on social media because it's the middle of February and campaigns traditionally don't happen in February in Ontario.
Only people who are specifically responding to my own post that I shared and made about it. So
there you go.
The general public, certainly not.
Okay. Alysson, healthcare, education are provincial responsibilities, but have very big local impacts. Workforce shortages in healthcare, policing, emergency services are affecting communities across the province of Ontario. When you're speaking to your municipal colleagues, your council colleagues, are you talking about what the parties are offering to address these shortages? Because I've had both of you on my show, and each time I ask, the resident does not care about that jurisdictional purview. They come to you with the question of what's in the provincial issues. I have an issue with healthcare. You're my local councillor. You're going to solve it. Are you looking at what the parties are talking about on those more provincial jurisdictional issues when you're coming up with your decision or your residents' decisions on how they're going to be voting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these are issues that face probably every community. Chatham-Kent is no different. We have almost a third of our population who are orphan patients, meaning they don't have a primary care practitioner. And that's an unhealthy population. When you don't have primary care access, those costs show up throughout the system at astronomically higher rates. So healthcare is something that is on everyone's minds, but in a way in Chatham-Kent specifically, it's been something that's been such an issue for so long that it's almost stopped being talked about. It's sort of come full circle. I don't want to say we've given up hope on that, but it's always something that is almost like a given that we're going to be lacking in healthcare professionals. And the pandemic certainly didn't help with that. And the fact that we're those who do exist are under a huge amount of pressure. I know I am fortunate. I have a GP, but she has a very large patient roster, because of the number of folks that she's trying to deal with. And if I need an appointment, I usually need to wait weeks or months to get in somewhere. So it's definitely a large pressure point on the system, which shows up in other ways. What I have been hearing, which is a provincial responsibility, because in Chatham-Kent, in the last year and a half, 2 years, we have started seeing our first large-scale homeless encampments. And that is something we have never seen in Chatham-Kent before, ever. Not during the Depression. I mean, I wasn't around during the Depression, but I have spoken with folks who have been around during that era. And these are human scale, but also systemic scale crises that we have never seen before in our community. And people are asking why that is. So that is something. And then at council, we are usually discussing issues related to that, or issues that stem from that. For example, why aren't people feeling safe going into some of our parks? Because they've been taken over by homeless encampments. Um, why are police short-staffed or, at the end of their rope? Because they're dealing with mental health crises that which is not normally part of their training or their role. Why are our social services staff, why are their budgets right at the limit? Because we're dealing with homelessness at a scale we've never seen before. And to Lukas's point, municipalities have basically two revenue tools: the property tax that we levy on ourselves and user fees. And when you're in a situation where you're going to rely on the individual taxpayer, many of whom are already on the edge financially, to pay for these things, it's just not going to work. And we're seeing that social fabric, I think, completely collapse. So when you talk about what are we hearing as councillors, that's what I hear literally every day. And that's, to me, if I had to boil it down to a single issue election, that would be it. 100%. Affordable housing and homelessness, which I think those are not separate. Those really do work. Those are two halves of the same circle. But I think if there is one issue this election, it's homelessness and affordable housing.
Okay, so
Every
I'm gonna probably ask the most political question I can in this roundtable, and I'm gonna put it out there. Whoever wants to take it can take it first. You both come from rural Ontario. You both come from the southwestern corner of Ontario. Now, if I was to pull up a map of the provincial election in 2020, the last provincial election and even the provincial election before that, I would hazard a guess that you guys are true blue. You are progressive, conservative blue, and there's probably not a lot of times where your riding has swapped back and forth between different political parties. I could be wrong. You guys know the ridings better than I do. Now, this election seems to be being fought in three different communities: Toronto, Ottawa, and the major centers of Brampton, Mississauga, and even Kitchener. Rural Ontario probably will not see a political leader come to their riding by this time, by the time voting ends. How do your rural municipalities get the issues of rural municipalities on the provincial radar when your ridings are seen as safe PC ridings? Who wants to take that?
Well, I mean,
Go ahead.
just to build on that quickly, we are a single tier municipality that was forced amalgamated, as Lukas mentioned earlier, from 23 municipalities into one. We have a 45,000 city of Chatham with a massive rural area the size of Prince Edward Island surrounding us. So we're a very unique community, but you're right, Chris. We've been blue, conservative for multiple elections now, but believe it or not, we were liberal for 30 years before that. So, and then we swung right to the right, if that's what you want to call it, and we've been there ever since. So I suspect you're absolutely right, especially in a short election that was called with a snap. And we likely won't see folks here from the major parties, which is unfortunate because I don't think you should be taking rural voices for granted. But that's why, how do you get your voices heard was your question. That's when you rely on the AMO and the Roma, the organizations that have been formed to represent those voices. Rely on them to get the word out. And also, we also have a role to play using our own communication channels and our own opportunities to spread the word about what's happening in our communities and raising those alarm bells, whatever those alarms we want to sound. But I think we all have an obligation as elected officials locally to make sure that we use every tool at our disposal to have our voices heard.
And just to jump in on that as well, I think it's actually it's pretty interesting where I think the opposition parties have, I wouldn't say abandoned. I think they do throw things out every once in a while, but they're certainly not putting in all the effort they could be in these rural ridings that used to be, used to be either NDP or Liberal. and they're not putting the same level of effort into these rural ridings. My own riding is largely dominated by Brantford, so it actually bounces around a fair amount. But certainly the ridings around me, a lot of true blue. I mean, even Hullman Norfolk, which borders my riding, currently has an independent MPP, but that independent MPP worked for the former Conservative MPP, and you had about 80% of the vote share tied up between, in the last election, the independent right candidate and the PC right candidate. So certainly there is a lot of that. But interestingly, I think the Green Party has actually been taking a decent stab at trying to address these rural issues, and they're actually targeting some fairly rural ridings. Currently, they're targeting Parry Sound, Muskoka. I think they're also trying to invest some money into Wellington, Halton Hills. So interestingly enough, the Green Party actually, I think, particularly with the whole Greenbelt thing, I think have found a wedge into agricultural communities. And I think they're taking a good stab there. And I do think both the Liberals and NDP are putting a bit of effort into it, though I think we could see more. Though again, what they get out of it with sort of the rural urban polarization that's really influenced by our southern neighbor below the border. Who knows? But I think that's sort of an interesting dynamic coming out of this, where the Green Party has found an interesting niche trying to tackle those PC ridings.
Good on Mike Schreiner. That's all I can say. I have two last questions, and they're both going to be open questions. And I'm going to start with Lukas on this one. Now, we are just 2 weeks away from the next government being declared, whether it be a PC majority, PC minority, Liberal, NDP government, who knows what it will be. What do you hope to hear? What do you hope for from the next provincial election, the next provincial government, when it comes to municipal issues? What's your hope for municipal issues for the next provincial government?
So I will admit to some of my own bias here. I up until September was actually the Brantford Brant's NDP riding president. However, I will probably surprise people in saying that I don't actually want to see an NDP majority government. I think some of the biggest flaws with this current PC majority government is that majority. There's not the opportunity to really take in and consider those other voices. So probably the ideal result I'd like to see is some sort of NDP minority government similar to BC. Certainly, BC has been making huge strides in things like homelessness and affordable housing that we aren't seeing here in Ontario with some of the lowest housing starts. So I think, if we're wishing upon a star, that's sort of what I would like to see.
Alysson?
I would actually like to see a minority government as well. And I am a little more agnostic about who it would be, but I think minority governments, you have to work better together. You can't force legislation through. You have to really work with your colleagues across the aisle, and I think that almost always results in better outcomes for the citizens. Um, I do think for me, what I would like to see, and this is probably my own personal bias as well, but I want to see unity. I don't want to see this sniping. We are facing economic crisis and chaos every other day from our southern neighbors. We need all three levels of government to work together. I don't want to see the sniping and the criticizing. We need to be all rowing in the same direction, whoever forms government at either level. I want to see the province back at the table with the municipalities as genuine partners. And that includes things like unfreezing Ontario works rates, which haven't moved a penny. The infamous penny, which no longer exists, hasn't moved a dime since I think 2008. It's some ridiculously long time. I want to see ODSP, Ontario Disability Support. I want to see that reflect modern needs. I want to see folks with the AODA. I want the Accessibility Act updated. It is out of date. It's 25 years old and doesn't reflect current realities and the millions of Ontarians who experience disabilities. And I want to see homelessness and housing we need to start moving the needle on that. We know, and that's what frustrates me so much, is that we know what to do. We're not sitting there going, "Oh my gosh, how do we fix this? What on earth is the solution? Someone please tell us." No, we're telling you as municipalities every single day on the front lines, we're telling you what we know we need. And from a fiscal, you can call me a bleeding heart, small L liberal, lefty, commie, pinko, whatever. But also, from a fiscally responsible perspective, when you address homelessness, you are saving a huge amount of money from emergency rooms and law enforcement and the criminal justice system and infrastructure impacts. It costs so much less to the taxpayer to address homelessness and provide safe and secure housing for people. So even for folks who have a different viewpoint on people experiencing homelessness, and that's fine, we all have different pathways to this, but when fiscal responsibility and responsible spending is your top priority, addressing homelessness is still the best option. So that's how Lukas and I have come to know each other. We're both advocating for similar issues on this, and it's been a wonderful experience. But it is so incredibly frustrating in the dead of February to see people sleeping outdoors. It is unacceptable in a country as wealthy as Canada, in a province as wealthy as Ontario. It is a systemic failure that we should all be completely and utterly ashamed of. And any government that forms in the next 2 weeks better have that at the top of their list, or people like me will be chirping until my last breath as an elected official.
And actually, I just want to jump back in there to sort of build off what Alysson was saying, and where we both commented on the benefits of having a minority government where you can have sort of collaborative conversations, because I think it's such a serious issue, our homelessness and affordable housing problem crisis, where there's lots of great ideas out there from the various platforms, and if only they were able to work together collaboratively to cherry pick all the good ideas from the different platforms and put them together, it really is going to end us up in a better place than any one of them having their sole platform push forward. Because you have the Greens are really pushing supportive housing. The NDP are really pushing a public builder. The Liberals are really pushing a lot of zoning liberalization, because as much as we would like to say, the truly deeply affordable housing is the whole solution, it's not. There's also market solutions as well that need to be part of it, and that zoning liberalization is important. So I think you're really going to get a lot better ideas if we're able to work collaboratively and really bring everyone together, like Alysson said, in sort of a unity government situation here, as opposed to us taking cheap jabs at each other at the soonest opportunity.
And just to add to that, Lukas, we've only seen one fully costed out platform. And that's from the Greens. To their credit, they have released a fully costed out platform. We're 2 weeks from the election, and the 3 other parties, including the current government, have not released a fully costed out platform. So that is challenging for Lukas and I and any other municipal elected official to really assess what these governments are going to do if elected, because we don't have that information yet. And I mean, in the defense of the parties that are not in government, they weren't necessarily prepared because they didn't know when the election was going to be called. But that doesn't really excuse the current sitting government, because they clearly knew when the election was going to be called, and they should have had that fully costed platform ready. So that is a challenge too. And for me personally, I have not decided, honest to God, who I'm going to vote for yet. By the way, vote, Madam Premier, shout out in Calgary, Alberta. But this is something I do believe there are folks that are willing to perhaps vote differently this time because of the state of our society right now in our communities, if they saw legitimate, concrete plans from any of the parties. I think folks are willing to vote differently this time if they saw those plans and those party platforms from the different political organizations. So I look forward to that. They don't have a lot of time left, but for me, I am waiting for that information before I cast my vote.
Well, I think that's the best way to end off this roundtable discussion. Thank you so much. To those who are listening, I just want to remind you that election day is February 27th. To find your polling location, go to elections.on.ca. There will be all the information that you will need for the proof of identification of what you need to bring to the polling stations to cast your ballot. Councillor Oakley, Councillor Storey, thank you so much for sitting down in the political trenches with Ian and I today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.